to that third bullet point there that would be helpful for you to know about our school in order to understand a little more about what we did and how maybe it could work for you. But take a couple of moments and converse with somebody that you don't already know about one or more of these topics, and maybe we can hear a little bit about what you shared.
We touch each other now.
I can do that. No, that's great. That's great. I can do that.
Yeah, we are too.
Yes. We just did one.
Maybe in the next few moments, if you could draw your conversation to a close. Works for Lee. Works for Lee. I'm doing it. Somebody want to share a thing that they discussed or learned, or something they'd like to know about our school?
So 30% FRL.
Free reduced lunch. Okay. That's our proxy for low socioeconomic status. Yeah.
Are some of your schools similar?
We're similar in size to the 1600, but not in like
Non-composition.
numbers. Yeah,
Sure.
not composition.
And that's new for us. Last in 16, 17, we had like 2,100 students. So they created a third high school in our district, and it drew almost exclusively from our school. So,
Yeah. What was yours? What is your? You were shaking your head about. Oh no, I'm from Texas, so definitely. I'm not at a school now, but the school that I was just at, which was a very, very diverse school. I mean, it was more like 80% Hispanic, or say in the 70s, and 18% African American. Very low white population. High SES, like 92% low SES, and so it's just interesting that it's very awesome that your district is focused on this.
please go ahead, Joanne. Another, yeah?
Can you put the slide back up?
Sure, yeah. This one.
Yes.
Sure.
So I live in Connecticut now, but I'm originally from Iowa City. I went to the rival high school. And one thing that's really interesting up here is how much the demographics have changed.
That's what we were talking
Yeah, so
about.
I graduated, I guess like 20-something years ago in the mid-90s. And I think both City and West High School at that time period were like 85 or 90% white. So there's been a really big change. A lot of it was an outmigration of black families leaving Chicago when public housing was decimated in Chicago. And so
We're only about 3 hours away from.
yeah, So, so I've noticed this change happening, and I'm really, really excited to.
Yeah, I came to West in the fall of '03, and I don't know the exact stats, but that 58% number would have been 20 to 30% higher than
Yeah.
that.
So is your position of Dean of Equity, or what, is that what it is?
I actually have a separate company, and I'm consulting to the
Okay,
district.
gotcha.
Yep.
That's what I was wondering.
I noticed the same thing. I have certain perceptions, you you think Iowa City, I thought for sure it was predominantly white in my mind's eye. I was surprised that it was as diverse a makeup.
Part of that is the university too. We're a big university town, and I think that brings in a lot of.
Which historically was the case when you look at the other larger cities in Iowa, and all of the cities in Iowa are now having these sorts of demographics, and the rural communities are not. So as folks are moving, they're moving to Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, Des Moines, places like that, where they're not urban by Census Bureau. Des Moines is the only one urban by the Census Bureau definition, but they're as close as you get in Iowa. So it is part of why we are on the journey we're on, is that this relatively new shift is one Iowans are still discovering, frankly.
I might have the one school that's way less diverse than yours, in Minnesota. So, but we might have similar characteristics of our white populations.
That's possible.
That's not very far on the journey of understanding race. And so I'm very interested to see how the white community has embraced this, because we're facing issues in our community. Even wanting to talk about the concept of equity. Great.
Let's jump in, yeah.
One
Why
more?
is there such a disparity between teachers of color and administrators of color?
Well, part of what we did is we put up the numbers, is it was one administrator of color made it 20%. So, we, because we were doing percentages, we wanted to stick with it, but it's like, in some ways, it is not typical. So, yeah, overall, the administrators of color is a higher percentage and a very small number.
We have a principal, 2 assistant principals, an athletic director, and a dean of students. That's who those 5 are.
And
So-
district-wide, it's about the same thing, because we have 1 or 2 people of color, but they bring up the percentages. Yeah. And we can talk another time about recruitment and retention, because that's another project we do, and we have other districts that are very different intentionally, but that's another topic.
All right. Okay. So we are really. We're going to talk about this later. Our principal came to this conference in April and learned about instructional rounds, and the reason why we engaged in them were basically we're on these these key premises. We were experiencing racial disparities in student experiences, and definitely our achievement gap, discipline, all of the same things that we've been talking about, all day today. We were seeing a lot of those, and we had a goal to reduce these disparities. And then we realized that it was high time that we were talking about race, and not such a cursory way, but really digging in and having what we would consider to be more uncomfortable conversations about it. But then we also decided that more importantly, we needed to include students in this. And how we sort of came to this was the University of Iowa's Public Policy Center crafted a survey, a climate survey our district does every year. And they survey all students. And when we got the results back, these were the results for our building specifically. We also got to see results for the whole district, and they were very similar. But we focused on these for our building, and you can kind of see that it was upsetting, to say the least, that there were so many students that were reporting feeling that the students in the school did not respect their differences, that they felt they were sometimes put down by their teacher, and that the teacher treats all races with respect, and the distance between the black students, what they said, and the white students, and what they said. And this was really probably I think it was one of the hardest faculty meetings that I've ever been in my many years of teaching, because of the reaction to, we were all very disheartened by it, but then during the conversation, there were certainly people, and this came up in another session I was in, or maybe it was in the whole group discussion, a lot of teachers, maybe understandably sort of, reacted sort of defensively, and they tried to qualify it and they tried to explain it away, or they would say, well, maybe the questions weren't phrased just right, or maybe they didn't understand, or maybe one time one person said one thing and so they said yes, and we ended up, that was made a lot of us really uncomfortable because we felt like people were still trying to avoid having the conversation. So, you know, we realized that we really needed to take this on head on and have some hard conversations, but then we also wanted to take these students that are in these percentages here, take them out of the statistics and actually talk to the students themselves. So we were trying to think about a way that we could engage the students in the process like we had never done before, and that's what led to these instructional rounds. And this is just an example of this. This is actually our second round of instructional rounds that we did without Lee, but with Cersei. This was the reaction of some of the kids at being part of the conversation and how they felt about it.
I just want to inject here really fast a quote. I think it's pretty close to what Jason said in the last session for those that were there, but when he said adults dismiss away data, that faculty meeting was a case in point of that phenomenon.
Yeah.
So.
That's fair.
So for me, there were some things that I had written down that I didn't think like would be, I guess, like valued or whatever. And I wasn't the only like African American student in the group, because like in the H group I had noticed that there was like 2 students and then like teachers. And the other girl in my group, like half of the things that I had written down, she had them down. So like sometimes it got to a point where like I was like, okay, maybe if I say this, like the teachers won't agree with me. So I like kind of like converse with her, and I'll be like, okay, did you write this down? Because I wrote this down. And then she'd be like, yeah, I wrote this down. Like, I see that you wrote it down. And then we'll just like talk about it. And then she'd be like, okay, maybe we should tell them about it so that they can put it up like on the posters that we did. And I guess that kind of like made me feel better about like the whole process, because I was like, okay, there's somebody here that can relate to me and stuff, you know, that actually listens to what I have to say. And like then I had to like realize that the teachers were going to listen to what I had to say too. So I started sharing out my ideas, and then they'll be like, oh yeah, I noticed that too. Like, I didn't think anybody else noticed that. And it was just, I guess it was just really great, because, you know, they were listening to me and what I had to say.
So how many of you have heard of instructional rounds as a process? Many of you, all right. Is anyone doing instructional rounds in their schools or in their communities? Okay, only a couple. So how about implicit bias? How many of you have heard of implicit bias? How many of you have been through some kind of a training around implicit bias? How many of you are using regular processes to overcome the impact of implicit bias? So we've got a few. All right, just to get a level sense of where we are, we'll talk focused on the instructional rounds, and then we'll likely weave some of the implicit bias stuff into the conversation.
So to take you back a little bit to last, or I guess it was a year and a half ago now, Cersei and a couple of her other trainers that work at West Wind Educational Policy met with groups of West High teachers. I think we had 2 or 3 groups that might have had a dozen teachers in each. And we met half a dozen times, maybe once each week for an hour and a half, with the specific purpose of trying to have conversations about race that were going to involve getting comfortable with discomfort and being okay with non-closure. We shared stories that involved race and that were things that maybe situations, interactions with students that perhaps had left us feeling like we could have done better, could have done more. Maybe it didn't end as well as we'd hoped. Perhaps even stories of when we didn't take action where we wished we had. And that allowed a group among our faculty, not the whole faculty, but maybe a quarter, something like that, to at least have some familiarity with that discursive space. And I think that was an important precondition to us feeling like we could establish such a community involving students, involving our bosses, since those types of conversations that cross hierarchical levels, I think involve a little bit more risk. The next step, I suppose, was Cersei's organization was instrumental in bringing Lee to Iowa City for us for a 3-day process in December of last year. And we had a little bit of work training ourselves in, without Lee there, about just what's the concept of low inference note-taking about. It's sort of a dragnet, kind of just the facts, ma'am, type of idea. Instead of making judgments about what's seen, you're writing down what's seen. And you're thinking about observations in a quadrant from judgmental to non-judgmental and from generic to specific. So you're trying to orient your observations and your note-taking to be specific and non-judgmental. More about that, or is that, okay? Some of the videos that we'll play a little bit later lend some support to the idea that this was a far easier process for students to do than for instructors to do, because the job of teachers is a little bit evaluative just by its very nature. What our 3-day process looked like, we got really, really familiar with this room that sometimes is used as a study hall, but as our schools has shrunk in size, it's increasingly been able to be used for special purposes related to professional development. So we had a lot of conversations in there and used a bazillion sticky notes in there, and not quite as much easel paper, but a lot. Who was involved in that? Looks like something's gotten cut off at the bottom there, but that's okay. We'll fill you in on that. We had 14 of our teachers, 3 administrators from our ESC, that's our district headquarter building. We had 8 students, 4 building level administrators, a guidance counselor. Lee was there, a couple people from the Iowa Department of Education, and then Cersei and 3 others that work with her. And we were in, I believe it was about 9 teams of 4 people each, maybe 8 teams, something like that. I think it's probably 8 teams because each team had 1 student, pretty much 2 teachers, and then 1 other person on it. So when we went to do classroom observations, that team stayed together and visited the same 3 rooms. Here's a few pictures just to let you sort of visualize a little bit about what the process was like, and then we kind of walk through a little bit of what we did each day. But we did a lot of work in small groups, and then moving around the room, taking a look at, like a piece of easel paper with a bunch of Post-it notes, and then some magic marker writing of what we saw as common patterns or meta patterns or high leverage patterns. He was talking about a lot of patterns.
I think we talked, a lot of conversations have come up with, about like, how do you decide who's gonna be in this? If you could imagine doing this at your school, like I think it's good to think about who would you invite? Whom would you want to be a part of it? And is everybody represented that needs to be represented? And I think we did, our first time around, we did a pretty good job of representation, and there was a sort of no rank. Everybody was equal, even our principals were sitting in little desks like this, and we were all there together talking. I will say that we felt that maybe we didn't do as good of a job as we could have in selecting students that really needed to be there and whom we really needed to hear from the most. So our second round, I think we did a better job with that, and I think that those conversations I learned even more.
Would you feel it's safe to say that the first time we had a pool of 8 students that were racially and ethnically diverse, but not as diverse in terms of their level of academic achievement, or their level of how disaffected they might have felt by the school? And the second time we really worked to try to make sure that there were students that were pretty well turned off by school who were part of that process.
Were they nominated by staff members, the students? Is
Yes.
that
Yeah.
for both groups? They were
Yes.
nominated?
Yeah. So we had a lot of English language learners the first time around, and that was partly because the English language teachers, English language ELL teachers were very active in wanting to get their students represented and that voice there, and that was it was very powerful that they were there. We also had African American Muslim students, and that was a particular hotspot for West High around the time of the election and the ban and that sort of thing, and so there was a real interest on some folks to make sure their voices were in. What we didn't have, we had no black boys in the first go-round. We had no African-American girls who were not Muslim in the first round. Second round, then we did. So it took a while for everyone to understand who they were nominating and what for, and then making sure we could get them. And again, it was 3 days out of class. So it was a big investment of time on the students' part.
Plus an afternoon beforehand where we were doing the low inference node training. So we were kind of asking a lot of those students. And I think we figured out a way to streamline it a little bit the second time, and then we were very intentional about trying to capture some students that represented groups that we didn't include the first time around.
The other question is about what teachers and adults do you include. You know, all of our administrators were in it, and then, you know how we were saying, the gentleman in the main meeting said, you know, preaching to the choir and all of that. I feel like we had the choir in there of teachers and everybody who was already very much on board, and I don't know that that was necessarily a bad idea. Our second round, we tried to bring in some new faces of people that might be a little bit more skeptical about this and who hadn't been through implicit bias sessions, and I think that's important to find that balance of people who, because you want it to be successful that first time for sure. And so I think that's a tricky part of it, I think, is who you invite.
So we had 3 days.
Sorry, go ahead.
And, no, I didn't mean to
Sure.
interrupt you.
I was
Okay.
gonna say, how many
Oh.
staff members are there? we
Oh,
have 100 total?
About 100 teachers this year. The staff might be as much as 130 or something, you know, I don't know precisely, but we went down from about 130 teachers to about 100 when this other school opened, and we went 25% fewer students this year. It might have been a really smart time to do something like this because our school population changed. Some people that maybe the last year or two they knew they were there weren't as invested and so forth. I think the vast majority of people that are at our school now want to be there because they would have applied for positions at the new school or something during this transition phase. So that first day, really our big goal was to develop our vision of what an equitable and diverse school would look like. What would be the signs that you could see when you walked into classrooms? What would students be doing? What would teachers be doing? What would the curriculum look like? And that was really hard and painstaking work. It took quite a while at the beginning to spend time getting to know each other and be comfortable having conversations about race. I think we brought in a few readings that we sat down in little groups and summarized what the other people in our group said. So it sounds like it was really just one task, but it took an awful lot of time to develop a trusting community where we knew that people could speak their minds. We focused quite a bit on this instructional core idea and really making sure that people understood that you can't change one of these three and expect anything different to come out at the end unless you change all of them. You know, sort of student, content, and teacher are united by the task, which is that central circle. The culmination of that first day was a document that
Which we'll hand out after their little
there it
activity.
is now.
yeah,
But we
yeah.
need to make you do some thinking for a moment here first. Your institutions obviously look a bit different than ours, as we talked about before. But ponder for a second and maybe talk to a person that's different than the one you did before. What would those signs be like? If those two bulleted statements were universally or nearly universally true, how would you see it? What would it look like?
So students believe diversity, inclusiveness, and equity are important at my school. If students were to say that about your school, what would that look like? If students believe that students in the school respect each other's differences, what would that look like?
So let's take about 2 or 3 minutes to think about what would the look-fors be if you were going to go observe classrooms and see if any of these two statements were true.
Okay. Those are some of the places where we can see. Okay,
And then also, so maybe this sort of thing, like sources, for a lot of teachers who back in like sources that are over different history or whatever, but that's so well, yeah, that's why it's well, and then also the reporter is, yeah, right.
Can we say that a lot?
No, yeah, but say that. Schools like like in New Jersey right now, it's just such a big deal. It's just the wrong way. I have to right, so but I will say. Oh, sure. I'm not talking about the national honors. I want to talk to you. So for now, and I started out as a elementary school. So the kids I started are now yes. And so I still talk to them so often. They were doing all this little like teaching, blah, blah, blah. So I started doing like things like one giant. I don't know why I'm doing like that. I think it would be really helpful for they don't want me to tell them. And I'll tell them. Okay. Can you finish up the point you're on?
Drawing all.
We have too many. Oh, I am. This year, yeah, we are. But I get it.
So before we share with you our document, sorry, I was going to keep it long, but cut me off. We're going to share with you the document that we came up with, and it was the whole group. Students were part of it as well. But before we just handed you a document, we wanted you to kind of think about what you would imagine seeing, and then you can sort of see what matches up with your vision, and maybe there will be some other things that you thought of. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But can you guys from your group maybe share one or two things that came up in your conversation about what you would see if kids said this about your school? What it would look like?
We talked about students actually raising, asking some questions about who's in the classroom with them, who's in various spaces in different positions. Students like noticing and also feeling empowered to question what's happening, as well as instructional spaces where student or teachers elicit responses, prompts, probes, or whatever, that elicit multiple perspectives within the space. Also mentioned active listening, where students are not just focused on talking and sharing, but also listening.
Some of those norms are really helpful. What about over here?
We talked a lot about the same, that the class should be open-ended discussion, not just like the teacher delivering what the information is, and then We talked a little bit about the resources and the displays in the classroom, especially in a situation where you have 98% of the teachers are white. You've got to visualize diversity and inclusion and help kids feel supported and comfortable through other methods. So we just talked about those.
Definitely something to learn. I thought what you, Andrea, said was really interesting about what you thought your kids would say.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of folks have mentioned similar examples of what that would look like, but it's open-ended, inquiry-driven lessons, tapping into the cultural wealth of our students. We have 90% girls, 90-something% African American, Latino, and I think a lot of our teachers focus on getting through content and structures in the classroom, and I wonder if that's because of the demographics of my school and why we're not challenging our students. You know, we do a really good job with getting them through Regents exams and state exams, but they're not college ready because we're not creating that environment for them to prepare to be college ready, to engage in open-ended. So I feel like if my students leave the classroom with more questions than answers, then we're approaching that. And right now they're not. They're just leaving with notes. Yeah. So.
Other groups that could share something else that they thought they would see? Yeah.
Well, I think it's such a big step for districts and schools and students and teachers to even identify the fact that it's a great thing for students respect each other's differences, and they felt like it was a safe environment to answer, and whatever the teacher was doing, enabled that or encouraged that. But I think, I always go back to how to actually do it. Like, I think it's such a big deal that people just even identify it. I think that's kind of your step, your first step.
Yeah.
But then what, when you have people who identify how to get that going, because it's not easy, and it's not easy to keep it continuous, so it's the revisiting. And we all have those strategies as educators that we do other things in that manner, so there has to be a connection and able to get that done. And so I just keep going back how powerful it is that people are having those discussions and schools are, and then, but what's that next step?
And that really leads nicely into what we'll talk about in a minute with the instructional rounds themselves, because that is the next step, and you don't leave without a plan. And I think we've all been just longing for a plan.
Yeah.
We talk and talk and talk, but which is important, and you have to identify it, you have to understand yourself and understand your school, but then I think people are longing for strategies and longing for more specifics, and so I do think that that's what they gave them. So Tyson's going to pass around our document that you are welcome to pilfer from if you want to use it, if it's helpful. I will say, the back is the more interesting and more relevant part now, because it's, if these statements were true, what would it look like when we look at students? What would it look like when we look at teachers? And what would it look like when we see content? The content in our classrooms, and I now refer to this weekly in my classroom, almost like a checklist that I can go through, and I say, after today, my classes today, would students say this? Would they be able to say I did these things, or that they saw these things in my classroom? Yes or no? And sometimes I'm like, oh, I did that one well, and then I'm like, oh, I didn't do that well at all, or I forgot about that. And so it's just something that's really nice, I think, to have, and every teacher in our building has this. And I like that it came from our students, and it came from what students said they would want to see and what we thought we would want to see, and it was really a cool process that we went through to develop this.
Yeah, one question I had is, okay, so you said now there's three high schools. You did.
Yeah, we
Okay.
had 4 actually,
Okay.
yeah.
So, are you the only school doing this kind of work?
Yeah.
Okay, I
think
just
so.
wondered.
Yeah.
It's a
And so-
pilot so far, so
Yeah,
our hope
right.
is.
Yeah,
Good.
our principal came here and was super inspired by it. She
The
came
core
back
of
and
this
said,
is
we're doing
really
it.
what we talked about before this, and really the meat of it's those bullet lists on the back. That's what you actually would see. So that was the hard work of day one, was generating these lists of what was on the back, I think.
And that's a great question that sort of also takes us to the systems piece. So like we've got systems within classrooms we're looking at, we've got systems within the building we're looking at, we've got the district system as well. So these questions were selected because the district, we got them to do a strategic plan that had 3 goals. each goal had an equity component embedded. Increase reading and close gaps, increase performance in mathematics and close gaps, and improve the experience of students. And they didn't realize how dramatically important that one about what all of them were, but especially the experience of students. Because the first thing they said is, how will we know? We're like, well, student climate surveys, we have one biennially at the state level. They do these student surveys. They're not great because they don't ask very many explicit questions about race. So they approached the University of Iowa and said, we need a better student climate survey. These are two of the questions from the survey that the district then pulled. So every year, every school is required to do a comprehensive school improvement plan as a part of getting federal funding. They've incorporated these then into the goals of the comprehensive school improvement plan. So not only are they in there and schools now have to say, how will I achieve 100% of this, but we also have a measure then. So we can measure our progress on student experience using these. I would have personally picked a couple of different questions from the climate survey, but there's a little bit about pacing the work. These felt like some of the survey questions that were palatable for the majority of folks involved, and they're all going to make a big difference. So we've kind of got the whole system bundled in classrooms and in the building and at the district level.
You might also find it interesting that we also pulled data, just FYI, for the LGBTQ population of our school, and that data also was concerning. And so the district created a task force, and we have now implemented a plan for that as well. So we have found the data fairly useful. Go ahead, sorry, you have a question.
Just quickly, in the name of systems, so are these bullets for teachers? Then what, like professional development topics and everything, and is that where you talked about implicit bias and those sorts of things?
Yeah,
there
so
was
as we
training
go
for
through the
teachers.
process, you'll get to see where they decided what are we going to do with
Got it,
this.
okay.
So this was day one. Get together, talk about race, meet Lee, meet my staff, get going, kind of ultimately say, what would it look like if we could do really, really well on these things? End of day one, we went back, we pulled together this, handed it back then on day two. We then said, so literally what are we going to look for? We broke up into our small groups that we're going to go around and observe classrooms. So what are the look fors? If this is what we think we would see, that's way too much to find in a 10 or 20 minute classroom visit. So each group said, all right, what are we going to look for? And some of them had different strategies. Some of them said, okay, you look at this, you look at what's on the walls, you look at what the students are doing, you look at what the teacher is doing. Others of them said, oh, we've got kind of this amorphous group of things, we'll all just look for it and collect our data. We talked about how we would go doing that. So these were some of each small group had their own, what are we going to look for when we go in? And then they grouped them separately, and they did them each their own way. So we just let the groups decide how are you going to go into the classrooms. So each team of 4 went to 3 classrooms for 20 minutes each. And so these are some of the decisions that you get to make as you design your rounds. Be interested to know what your choice was. One idea is we can all go to the same 3 classrooms. We just rotate in and out. And then we come back and we've got a community experience and we can talk across. A different way is we'll just all go to as many different ones as we possibly can, so we'll have a broader vision of what the school does. How have you done it at Niles West?
Both.
Both?
And again, I think when we started out, developmentally speaking, we were just learning the system and building trust and relationships. We kept it to like 3-4 classrooms where teachers were comfortable with that type of activity going on. And then as we moved along, it was open, and so you're collecting data from across the board.
So one thing is we're a university town. The actual town of Iowa City is about 50,000 residents and 30,000 students at the University of Iowa. So there's a lot of people that come and observe things in the classroom. So there's a little more initial comfort with kind of researchers coming in. So that was part of why I think that the principal felt like I could maybe first time out get more
But the very
classrooms.
first time, there was a Google form that he sent out a week before saying, hey, on this particular Thursday, tell us a little about what you're doing during periods 2 and 3. And so teachers, I think, had a pretty easy off-ramp if they said, oh, we're testing that day, sorry. Or like you mentioned, field trip day, we won't be there at all. I mean, I've got a sub-personal day, whatever excuses or things they could do. And I think for this first round, and maybe even the one in April, we were a little less concerned about trying to pry our way into the unwilling. You know, instead just, let's focus on making this a cool thing that people will spread the word about it being a cool thing.
Long term.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think down the road, the plan will be to get every nook and cranny observed.
So as we noted, what we were doing then is we had our notes in our notebooks, and we came back together and we each had little Post-it notes, and we were each able to pick 10 pieces of data that we saw when we were going in our look fors. What were 10 of these low inference data points? And we wrote them out on this. And as I mentioned, it's fascinating to hear the teachers kind of reflect on what happened, and Carrie was even sharing how the students are better at that, and how she actually rewrote her stickies based on what the students were writing on theirs, because they'd seen the same thing and wrote about them very differently. So I loved that a teacher was actually admitting she learned from her students.
That was a great chance in those groups of 3 or 4 to work on making our individual data more specific and less judgmental.
And just to remind you guys, I mean, this is, no, you can go back, or you can
That's
go
good,
ahead.
that's good, yeah.
In case you're not quite understanding, or you feel like teachers would be really worried about this, we made it very clear, and even afterwards, teachers were asking us, can we ever see the notes that you took from my classroom? And we had to really say to them, you don't understand, we use no names, we use no student names.
No room numbers.
We
There's
only
nothing on those
said,
Post-it notes that would allow you to identify.
Teacher spoke, gave assignment, teacher explained slides on whatever, students were sitting like this way, we did seating arrangements, we said, 4 white girls here, 3, you know what I mean, we really did, it was so generic, and so, I mean, informational, but so non-specific to who it was and not
It might have been
evaluative.
specific to whether it was math or whether it was
Right,
history,
right.
something like that.
Right,
But our
AP
school's big enough that
physics,
that's not one teacher.
35 students, 3 girls, or something like that, and all boys, whatever it was.
So each small group would have about 40 Post-it notes, and so the next task was then to group them into common kinds of themes that we were seeing as we had our specific observations. So things like respectful communication, attention to student needs, engagement with each other. Each group was kind of, now so we're starting to make some sense of what we saw across the different observers in the groups. This was an interesting one. Black students are always helped by white or Asian students. This was an observation that a student and a black teacher both saw across 2 different classrooms. They were in the same group. And they were noticing, they had a lens that others in their group hadn't seen that. And so that was also part of the power, is students were coming up with things they were seeing. And then we know the apprenticeship of whiteness is the sort of thing that does happen, and that we actually can, it's kind of one of those things we can reinforce in a system. We were seeing it and had some data to come up with that. So the diversity of the participants also was a key element to why this worked.
And do you see the other notes, like the AP class, least brown,
Oh,
low
yeah.
level class?
These are the focus of a big
A big pattern that we noticed.
pattern, yeah.
So that's what we did. We pulled them all together, and then we just would do a big gallery walk across all of the different small groups, talked a lot about it, and then ultimately said, hey, what are those high leverage themes? What are those few themes that if we were intentional about it at West High School, we could move the needle in the next year? Building-wide patterns that would really improve equity and student outcomes. And that was a big part of the processing that we did.
And it was really hard and exhausting, as you can tell by my physical.
This is one of the cheeriest teachers at our school. I know you think maybe she's not. I think the frame, she's thinking, she's deep in thought. Anyway, we're gonna let this one go.
So like, as a student, I come into class each day and I don't really pay attention to like this kind of stuff. But then like, when I actually got to have the lens of like maybe what a teacher would see, like, and how the class is being taught, like I learned so much more. And that like made me think so differently, and I learned a lot out of it.
I found that students didn't struggle as much with the low inference note-taking of the observations. They were actually very good.
To these 3 classrooms yesterday, I like saw the way people were sitting and how they were interacting with one another. And like again, I really never paid attention to this kind of stuff, but now like when I come on Monday, maybe I'll just see like where everyone is and like how they're acting around one another, and maybe what the teacher even does too, and how they interact with the students. Like, I'll be much more observable with that.
In the beginning, I was certainly glad that kids were there. I thought it was really great that kids were there. By the second day, or maybe even the end of the first day, I changed my thinking to it was essential that kids were there. And I thought, and then by the end of today, I feel like we could not have done this without their input, and it would have been a very different result had they not been part of it.
Just having them on the rounds itself, their view is so very different of what's going on in the classroom compared to where we are always focused looking at. And had we not included them on this discussion and heard what they were seeing at the same time as we were recounting what we were seeing, I don't really think we would have gotten as far in this work as we did. Not to mention the fact that they have so much at stake in this discussion. And these are a lot of conversations that are not happening in our school, and had they not been brought in, we're never going to get an opportunity to figure out how to have these discussions.
The teachers care more about the students than we think. In this situation, we can see that they care about us and they want to help make better the school for us.
There's a couple things that they're probably going to be upset with me because we didn't plan this when we talked about it, but these are things that I heard today, and they're all sort of spokes revolving around this central point. In the last session, I think probably misquoting Jason as saying, at first we forgot the students in school improvement, but they're our clients. Dr. Asante this morning, children know what's up, but we won't listen. Credibility is conferred by letters after name and commas in the paycheck. Dr. John King said they're desegregated at the doorway, but segregated in the hallway and especially in the classroom. And then asked, what if our whole system was organized around the success of that kid? And then in the five person conversation this morning, I believe it was Angela that said our students should be at the center of the work of curriculum design. And all those things to me pointed toward this central theme that students are at the center of what we do, and education needs to involve and include them and not be something that's done to them. So that's my off-script part, but I used the notes page. Everybody's checking the camera there. I used the notes page. So when we kind of zoomed out from these big easel pages with all these sticky notes, and we kind of pondered about exactly what kind of a endorsement deal that Lee might have with Post-it and 3M and so forth. We used a lot of them. We noticed a few things. The school as a whole, as you saw, is at least a bit, for Iowa, racially diverse, but the classes are not. The classes are disproportionate compared with the way the school looks. If you look in the remedial or basic track classes, they're a lot more brown and black. If you look at the AP and honors classes, it's almost exclusively white and Asian students. And then we noticed that when students self-segregate, when they choose their own seats, choose their own small groups, they self-segregate by race and gender. And you saw some of the Post-it notes pointing about where that was more the case or less the case, but it's always somewhat the case. Students, and I think this might have been more true of students of color, but they seemed invisible or marginalized or not engaged. Teacher-centered classrooms appeared to have low levels of student engagement. These were 4 patterns that I think a month after we did the instructional rounds, we had a faculty meeting where, because teachers wanted to know, what was this thing where you traipsed people in and out of our classrooms? Like, tell us what you found out. You studied. What were the results? Well, these were sort of the 4 results. I guess I'm.
When the students are invisible, marginalized, and not engaged, is that all students or some students? Students in particular settings?
We notice patterns of particularly students of color.
That's an interesting statement for you to have zoned in on, because I believe that 3rd bullet point was a kind of toned down version.
This is not, so what happened is the group came up with this as the way they characterized what they saw, and they were focused on students of color, and we had a very interesting series of moments where we were also talking about ethnicity. So we were talking about the Latinx students and their experiences, and the Latinx administrator and her experience in the room of often feeling invisible. And part of it being often not knowing by looking whether someone is Latino or not. And then ending up being invisible because we don't ask, we don't talk about it, we just don't address it. It's a very black-white conversation in Iowa City. So we offered white and Asian students often get lumped together because we're talking about AP. And yet there's all sorts of diversity within Asian students. There's all sorts of diversity across the school. We don't get into those levels of nuance about race and ethnicity very often. And so it's all invisible. It ends up being invisible, and primarily we're talking about students of color.
The other thing that we found that I think would qualify that second one a little bit more too is when students were allowed to sit where they wanted to sit, because a lot of times when we went up to observe, we would lean over and ask, did you choose your seat or were you assigned a seat? Because you can interact with kids, you can ask questions. They would self-segregate. But when the teacher made, I think probably a noble effort to mix up students, they didn't talk to each other. And so, one thing that really resonated with a lot of us as educators was that we work so hard on our relationships with kids, and we know how important our relationships with our students are and connecting with them. But we really don't do enough to make them connect with each other, and they don't know how to talk to each other. And we just couldn't believe how quiet and awkward they really were. And so that was kind of, that I think that qualifies that second one a little bit more. Yeah.
Is training students to do the instruction rounds? I know it was around the instructional core, but like how specific were you in training them on workforce that then kind of got to these patterns?
They developed them right along with us, though.
Okay.
They were in there for the entire process. I think, not the first two girls that you saw in the first two video, but the four students you saw in the last one, and the two students that were sitting to Carrie's left there. They were in every meeting about instructional rounds and every training about instructional rounds that I was in. So I didn't have any more background about it than they were.
They practiced note-taking just like we practiced note-taking.
We watched a little video of a teaching situation, we wrote some stuff down, we saw examples of high inference, low inference, look back at your notes, can you make them more low inference, all of that. So, and they were, students were every bit as involved as teachers in the development of this document.
So when the groups were together, I, being the kind of racial equity consultant, said, can we
sorry.
go back to the?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, all right, so, this one, I do think that actually did say students of color. Oh, let's maybe share this, because that did say students of color are invisible. And
This is the one that we it was like
So-
toned down for the faculty meeting.
for the faculty meeting, it was, students, here, I pulled it up because I thought, I want to make sure you know this. Students of color not connecting with the teacher, the material, or other students.
That was
the way
what
that
the
was shared, a choice by a specific person to share it that way, which was about pacing the work. If you know adaptive leadership, you got to pace the work, you can't blow it up. It also frames the conversation very differently than students are invisible, marginalized. Who has what agency and what responsibility for the positionality is different in those two different statements. So that was pretty important. We thought a lot about what were we actually doing in the room, and were we talking about race? So that was mine, where I said, all right, this fourth group, I'm worried you might not talk about race. Because that's a sexy and exciting topic, teacher-centered classrooms versus student-centered classrooms. And I've been doing this in the state of Iowa in a statewide consortium for 5 years, talking about personalized learning, competency-based education, shifting the locus of who does what in the classroom, and we almost never spoke of race in that process. So we offered to that group, you may find that when you're going, you end up not talking about race, so be careful about that. And that was one. Do you want to share how Andreas made his impact?
Yeah, the last student you heard there, Andres, the way he put it, because I was part of that group, and Cersei kept telling me, okay, you got to make sure this group doesn't just never talk about race, because if you forget it at the beginning, you'll never get back to it, right? Okay. So I kept pushing, and finally he said, if the student population is racially diverse, but the teaching faculty isn't, and you have teacher-centered education, could it ever really be diverse and responsive to who the students are? And he was, I give him so much credit, he was so forceful about continuing to make that point, and saying this is really almost, the student-centered focus is really almost a precondition if we have a white faculty and a student population that's not. So I will give them some credit for that. Maybe we've talked enough about sort of what was, a bit challenging for the faculty to hear that and about how we came up with them. But I suppose if anybody has a question they got to ask right now about those 4 patterns, feel free.
Just a comment, we're, I don't know about you, but I'm seeing so many different patterns, or I'm having deja vu when we first started our work and the things that you're saying. 'Cause I remember dancing around the race thing with the faculty as well. And it took time, to really just to name it. And our kids were the ones that helped really give us the courage to do so. And I think that's another advantage as well, because, it's such a difficult piece. Everyone wants to talk about socioeconomic as a distractor, maybe gender as a distractor. But when you break it down each time, by any demographic or any indicator, race is always, especially if you look at the data nationally or locally, wherever you're at, typically it's Black Latino, whether you're looking at income, you're looking at gender, who's it. And so I remember we would try to soften some of the language, but it got to the point where it's just so obvious. You're just compelled. So I think, I'd be curious to know how the faculty handles that as the professional development, as it evolves. The other thing I was going to mention, Cersei, you had said something about the students having a unique lens and seeing an interaction where certain students are helping other students. I think we did a practice, we did a workshop where we had higher level questioning, and just, they low in for the procedural versus more higher cognitively pressed type questions, higher order questions. And one of the students, they said that it was interesting in who the teachers called upon, or if they called on students of color that they didn't answer initially, who would then they go to save that student. They never returned back to the student.
Which students do you press with a follow-up, and which students do you just accept a little bit of a low-level answer and then move to
So
something
there were
else?
some,
Throw them a softball
there were
question
some
because you want
blind
to get it
spots
right.
that the students brought to our attention, similar to what you had brought out there. That you're like, wow, we need to see that.
I was in a session, this was really an important realization for a lot of us. Cersei had to kind of rein us in a lot. I was in her group and she kind of had to say, do you realize that you're not talking about race anymore? And we were like, damn it. And she's like, that's what white people do. And I thought, I was just in a session, the last session where there was a white male presenter, a black male presenter, and the white male presenter said, I just learned that I was white 6 years ago. And then the black presenter said, well, I've always known I was black. And I thought it was just really interesting because you have to be so intentional and so be careful about that. And we needed people to rein us in the whole way through, unfortunately. Oh, okay, so then this is where I look really tired in the video, and my hair looks really greasy, because this is where we were like, oh, this is so hard, but it was good hard, like it was good difficult, it was really hard thinking, where we decided, we sort of picked our 4 areas, and then we divided up amongst which one was the most interesting to us and which one we wanted to pursue, and then we did that root cause analysis, which probably some of you have done before, where you put the problem up and then you say, okay, so students segregate themselves. Why? Because here's a reason, here's a possible reason. Why? Okay, here are 3 more reasons. And well, why? And you just keep going and keep going and keep going. And that's where you start having, I think, really insightful, really difficult conversations, and you become very aware, well, because it's easier. It's easier just to let them pick their own groups. It's easier, it's too hard to try to teach them to talk about race in the classroom, and it's easier to ignore the problem or whatever. We just came up with some really interesting things, and then from that, we talked about how we could address it and what we would need, what education would we need, what kind of support would we need, what kind of resources would we need. If we want to move forward on this, what do we want that moving forward to look like? And we came up with very specific plans. This is what we're going to do. And then now we are in the process of implementing those things.
We're trying.
We're trying.
Yeah, but part of that nature of that ride cycle is that it's iterative, and when you take action, then you got to examine and study some more. Lee was very clear with us on day 3 that, okay, this wonderful feeling you have right now, it'll go away when I go away unless you continue to do the work. So we've done some things since then. It's always hard to know whether it's not enough, or if you have too many initiatives, then maybe you don't have any initiatives at all. Because if you're at a school that has 10 initiatives, you might not be doing anything, right? You have a handout with 10 bullet points, but that doesn't mean you're doing anything, right? So what have we done? Well, we did some work with a nonprofit called Equal Opportunity Schools, and this has to do with addressing the disproportionality of who's in classes. Instead of just looking at metrics like GPA and test scores to try to figure out readiness for honors and AP, we looked at things like student interest and what their career goals were, and then tried to have students identify who's a trusted adult in the building. Those trusted adults had individual conversations with the students. Our goal is to have every student who leaves West at least have a college level experience in one thing before they go. But we can't view it as only an enrollment issue. I think Jason in the last session said something about how, if you just say the problem is not enough black kids in AP, and then you push black kids in AP, that doesn't really fix the thing. That's the problem of focusing on just one vertex of the instructional core, perhaps. So part of that, it also involves having a tutoring center where we've identified students that were successful in those classes this year, and make sure there's time during the school day, so students that are bused maybe and can't come early or leave late have a chance to get help from a student who was successful in that course the previous year. Then we had a meeting, and it's not just AP teachers, because in some cases you don't even get to AP Spanish, let's say, unless you're in Spanish 2 honors. You don't get to AP English unless you take English 10 honors. So we figured out where are the entry points, where are the on-ramps to our fast lanes. We've got a lot of kids that do really well in the fast lanes at West High, and I think at the beginning of this process, our school is great. And then we sort of work to, our school works well for many students. And the refined version of that is like our school works very well for the vast majority of white and Asian students of means. And those are really very different statements than the one we started with. We did another version of equity-focused instructional rounds with all the same students and then a bunch of new students in April. And I think our plan is to have that be a regular process moving forward. Cersei and her people conducted some focus group conversations with students just within the last couple of weeks. And we've got plans to make sure that all the faculty engages in that same implicit bias conversation process that some of us got a chance to do during last school year. So these are a few of the things that we've been working on. I think we want to make certain that we get to a couple of videos here, but maybe I'll blitz through a few more slides since we have them here. These are some of the factors I think that the 3 of us at least attribute the success of our instructional rounds to. I'm not saying that you would have to have all of these components to make it successful at a different institution, but given the school we are, I think these are some of the ingredients that help make that be successful. Somebody asked me last night at the evening thing, was it absolutely essential that Lee was there? He's just walked in, so I'll say the answer is of course yes, except to say it wouldn't necessarily have to be the individual Lee, right? I think it was vital that we had somebody from the outside who wasn't seen as having an agenda, who wasn't a part of our school, so that the leaders of our school could be participants rather than leaders of that process. And whether that was Cersei or Lee or somebody else, that person helped invest some time to making it a comfortable zone and getting people into the idea of being comfortable with the uncomfortable. I think that was an essential part of the puzzle. Sorry, Lee, if that's...
I would say the same. I would say the same thing, except you didn't say how wonderful, charming. But Eddie, you can find out.
We said all those things. So you can watch the video. We said all that stuff earlier.
Did anybody have any questions about the things that we've implemented? Because we kind of went through this quickly. Yeah.
I do have a question. Similar to what I asked in the first session. Did you have any instances where you were faced with adults in a conversation that took a position of, I don't believe in white privilege, this is not real, I didn't own slaves, so it's really, I don't have to engage in this conversation. And if you did, and I think you did, looking at, your reaction, how did you engage them in the work meaningfully? Like going back to that self-conversation at the beginning of the day?
We didn't have anybody that felt that way who participated in the instructional rounds.
And people who were in the implicit bias trainings absolutely started there. Many people started in that place. It's either not me, it's the kids and the family and the community, and putting the responsibility outside of the school. White privilege isn't real. Colorblindness actually was the number one challenge, the ideology of colorblindness, that we went in thinking, oh, they've had all this cultural competency work, we don't have to start there, and realizing, oops, nope, we kind of had to start there because folks believe that it's the right thing to not see color. That's the colorblind ideology. So there were steps we had to get through. So the fact that we had a year of working through that, once a month for 10 months with groups of teachers to start to chip that away a little bit, we were able to show through University of Iowa's evaluation program that the teachers who entered the implicit bias training, many of them would place the responsibility for the achievement gap on students and their families at the beginning, and we had significant change by the end. So it mattered that we had folks in the room that were already bought in, and so I think if you're I don't think you could just plop in instructional rounds with an equity focus and students without having done some of that pre-work.
I noticed that parents aren't engaged, or they weren't engaged in these instructional rounds at all. And I'm just wondering, at what point in the process have you engaged parents, or are you planning on engaging parents?
I don't think we have.
We haven't.
Right.
I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
So, I'm happy to respond to that, but also, if you just go back to the slide prior, I feel like on that, you're leaving out the implicit bias work. It's not listed as a bullet. And
You're right.
I think it's an important bullet.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we're learning, and you saw that in some of what I said, and what some of Bernice said, is that you got to do upfront work around bias, around developing, understanding what we mean by racial equity. And so I had the luxury of coming in 3 days and just knowing that the adults had done that, and that made a big difference. And so I definitely want that. In terms of the parents, so rounds started. This is now like a 1 minute, but 12-year history. Rounds started in most cases as administrative rounds, and we had groups that principals who were doing principal networks or superintendent networks, and then they were stunned when we said, you really should involve teachers in this. And then teachers was like the next big thing. And then a few years ago, some of the schools that we in district were working with, we were saying there's no reason not to include kids or parents. And so we now, for the last 3 years, we have a number of districts that have been that have had kids on rounds, including Iowa, including I'm looking at anyone who went to the Niles West, and there's a district in Connecticut. We're starting a Connecticut network that's building on that. And the same is true for parents. It's like, can you have a trusting relationship with parents where they're seeing the system and not just coming in and seeing, well, this is what's happening in my kid's class.
Right.
I mean, one of the challenges for everybody, for the kids on this, for the teachers, administrators on it, is seeing that this is not about fixing individual teachers. This is about looking at systemic issues in our school and getting better in systemic issues in our school, in this case around race and diversity and equity.
I do really want to make sure we have time for 2 very short video clips here, because I think they're really powerful. We chose to end with them, so I don't want to deny them. This is a social